Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 29th year, I talk to writers and other artists about their craft, what they've accomplished, what they're working on, what they're going to plan for the future. It's a pretty wide net. We have had on writers of all kinds, novelists, journalists, poets, and we have had on other sorts of artists. We have had on musicians, actors, sculptors. It's a wide net. If you have an idea for a guest who might be a good, creative person to interview on the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the show. I would love to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that this is a result of cable television. You can't get this wonderful public service of local programming about and for Cape Ann if you subscribe to Dish. So you stay away from those commercials. Tonight, I'm very happy to say we do have a sculptor, a distinguished local resident by the name of Ken Hruby, and he's going to explain after we meet him about these mysterious-looking sculptures that are between me and the camera. Ken Hruby was born at a cavalry post in the Black Hills of South Dakota. He spent an adventure-filled childhood as an Army brat at a number of posts and camps in the Midwest and West. During the following 21 years, I skipped a line there. He was a graduate in 1961 of West Point. During the following 21 years of active duty, he served in a variety of command and staff positions, including a tour of duty as advisor to infantry and ranger battalions in Vietnam and 2 combat tours on the DMZ in Korea. When he retired from the military, he attended the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where he focused on sculpture and received a prestigious Traveling Scholars Award. His work has been shown in numerous group and solo shows on the East Coast and in Paris. He is represented in private and public collections, including the National Vietnam Veterans Museum in Chicago. His first solo show, Mustering Out, and 3 recent shows, Juggernaut, Minefields of Memory, and Free Fall, were selected by the Boston Globe as best gallery events for the years in which they were presented. Ken Hruby, thank you very much for coming down and being
My pleasure. My pleasure to be here.
I should add that there was another show, I believe, called Trepanation.
Trepanation.
Trepanation was
Right.
a later show after
Right.
this intro was written. And I wonder, so the suspense doesn't build too long for our audience, if you can talk about that show, Trepanation, and that will give a little background to these sculptures in front of me.
My pleasure. I was a warrior once, young then, well-educated and trained by the best the Army had to offer in all of the skills that distinguish the infantryman, airborne, and ranger from the rest. I humped with my fellow grunts the frozen mountains of the DMZ in Korea and the steaming dank jungles of Vietnam. Always alert and ever vigilant to the slightest anomaly that might suddenly end or alter a life, those who went outside the wire downrange were in fact changed forever. The changes, invisible save to a close few who knew us before deployment, frequently burrowed deeply, hiding in the dark folds of quotidian chores and obligations where they might remain submerged and suppressed. Or they might erupt to manifest themselves unpredictably. Mine found a voice in the form of sculpture. Much has evolved since I retired from the battlefield. In subsequent wars, the terrain, the mission, the equipment, and the enemy are all different. What has been the constant of warfare for millennia and remains so for warriors of any society who are sent to act where diplomacy fails is the personal toll, the after effects, and the protracted personal and social consequences of combat duty. No one who has seen the elephant is unchanged by it. No one.
No one who has seen the elephant.
This work tries to focus attention on some of the facets of that toll. The links of improvised explosive devices to concussive injury, to trepanation, to tinnitus are real. The toll is real. It evanesces out to infinity. And at this point, you need to strike.
This.
So I made these pieces as a result of going down to Walter Reed Army Hospital. My nephew was the commander of the Wounded Warrior Brigade, and he asked me to come down and talk to some of the warriors down there and see if there was some way I could transform that experience into art making. So I went down there and I found these guys running around with football helmets on, not knowing that they had been trepanned.
Define trepan.
Well, trepanning is the process of cutting a hole in the skull through the bone to allow the pressure to be released after a concussive injury. We have found skulls that go back 8,000 or 10,000 years that have been trepanned for some reason. We think there was perhaps a way to let the evil spirits out for people who had been mentally ill or depressed or something. But they used it in the battlefield. Occasionally they would take the piece of bone that was removed from the skull and insert it in the skin on the stomach to keep the bone viable on the theory that they were going to replace it. But that viability was apparently not very effective. So these kids who had the football helmets on down at Walter Reed, their skulls were replaced with titanium or some artificial device. So I made these helmets in a way that was an attempt to take the ancient helmets that came from the Greek and Etruscan archives.
Yes, the one we just had on a second ago looked Greek or even earlier, perhaps.
Right. I blended them with the contemporary helmet form from World War II, and then I anthropomorphized them so that they took on, I won't call them self-portraits, but they took on a more contemporary look to them.
Did you intend them to ring?
Yes.
And that bell?
And the bell was an attempt to bring in tinnitus to this whole project. Tinnitus is the ringing in the ear that anybody who's had a concussive injury suffers with.
And as you get older, it kind of creeps in as
Precisely,
well. And it's mispronounced. I know I wanted to point that many people mispronounce it tinnitus. But it's
I think it's tinnitus.
It is tinnitus, yes.
So I thought the combination of the oral ringing, and that's why I say it evanesces to infinity, because
it's a very nice line.
We don't know.
That specifically story about the inspiration of Walter Reed is very it's moving because it's so immediate and it's so it's so based on concrete problems and concrete injuries and suffering.
Well, I cast them in. Go ahead.
No.
I cast them in bronze. I cast in aluminum, and then I took my uniforms that I had in a footlocker, and I shredded them up and made paper out of it. And I cast one in combat paper of my fatigues and my Class A uniforms for the third one. And I like the idea, the irony of a paper helmet. It is allegedly an impenetrable form made out of it's like a paper tiger. It has no substance to it.
Yeah.
And I did the same thing with the hand grenade. I put the hand grenade in the form of.
Here, let me hold that. I'll hold that up. This is see if I can get this. Yeah, right there. This is a. Would you say that again? Describe that again, Ken.
The hand grenades cast out of fatigues, old combat fatigues, and I again like the idea that we have this form that is explosive, but it's made like the paper tiger with no potential whatsoever.
Now, that's wonderfully symbolic of your whole two-career history, taking the fatigues and making them into paper mache art.
Yes.
You took your experience and you're a retired colonel, I should mention. You took your experience as a military professional in combat and transferred that and moved that, morphed that into art, which you did in a smaller way, but taking your fatigues
Right.
and making art out of them. How can you say something more general about how that transformation took place? When you graduated from West Point, for instance, were you thinking in the way back of your head you're going to be an artist someday?
No. I had no expressed talent at it. We got an engineering degree, so you had a sense of space, sense of spatial relations, pretty well developed. But I got stationed out in Fort Hood, Texas, where there wasn't a lot of off-duty activity. If you could hunt, you were okay. If you could fish, you were okay. But if you didn't do those things, there wasn't a hell of a lot to do in Texas.
Fort Hood is a lot smaller then than it is now, I imagine.
Yes, Fort Hood is immense. And so I took a welding class at the craft shop, and I kept a welding rig with me, and I made really bad gifts for my friends and relatives that I'm embarrassed about at this point. But it was a start for me, and it gave me a sense of the material. And then when I retired from the military, I took a look around, and I did not want to become one of the revolving door of military officers who go into the civil service, who go into contracting. I just didn't want to do that. I find that some parts of that are abhorrent, and so I decided I was just going to go to art school. Had no idea that it was not going to be a financially viable decision, but I've had a lot of fun and I've enjoyed myself.
I went into poetry for the money.
Yeah. There's big money in that.
So it evolved from that welding class. Was that offered on base, by the way, or just out in the community?
No, it was offered on base.
On base. Yeah. So it kind of evolved from. You must have gotten some pleasure and some creative kick out of.
I did
making those
great,
embarrassing artifacts.
Great fun. And when I got to the museum school, I discovered that I could go into the welding shop, and I could deal with strictly formal issues. No content, no hidden meanings, no double entendres, and I did a whole 3 or 4 years of nothing but formal abstract work, some of which are at the Cape Ann Museum in the courtyard. And at some point I went to see the movie Platoon, and Platoon was a cathartic experience for me. It was the closest thing to my experience in Vietnam of any of the Vietnam movies. The others were just so over the top in their hyperbole that, but Platoon really had an effect on me, and it sort of gave me permission to deal with autobiographical issues of being in combat and being in the military. And what I've tried to do all the way throughout this autobiographical series is keep the work that deals with some of the ironies of military service, some of the things that don't normally get discussed. It wasn't all blood and guts. There was a lot of sitting around waiting and hurry up and wait. Right. That should be a patch on the arm. 82nd Airborne,
hurry up and wait. Yeah. It's interesting to me that you said you were so influenced or moved by Platoon,
right,
rather than mentioning Apocalypse Now or Full Metal Jacket or a lot of the other movies that were based in Vietnam.
Yeah, they were over the top for me. Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now were caricatures of what my experience was. My experience essentially was I was alone, with about 500 Vietnamese and Montagnards in the highlands, in the jungle, and on the coastal plains. So I didn't have the camaraderie that the American units had in their execution.
You were alone.
Well, for the most part, I was
alone.
alone.
With a squad, or
no, I was the single American advisor to these units, and I had a sergeant for about a month, and at one point I had for another operation, and they gave me a radio operator, but essentially I was by myself. And the people I was advising, they had been in the Foreign Legion. They spoke French. So we had these conversations that were triangular as vocabulary allowed. And
you speak French?
I do, yeah, or I did, and I spoke Vietnamese.
So you get what was your rank at that time?
I was first lieutenant.
Oh, so you're right out of...
Well, I'd already been to Korea for 18 months on the DMZ. So this was my second tour in the Orient. So I'm orientally oriented. So it was a different tour than the people who were with American units.
Yeah. Do you draw more on Vietnam than Korea, or is it all one body of memory and
it's all one body
and emotion?
Yeah, it's all one body. I've done a lot of work about minefields. I've done lots of work. The helmet has become an icon, and I've tried to transform it away from its protective role and make it an active part by anthropomorphizing it. And I did a piece that I took a steel helmet and I cut flips in it so that you could see underneath images, poetry, music, lots of things that you would not expect to find in a soldier. We expect soldiers to be kind of hard-drinking hellraisers, and that's a stereotype. There's a lot of them that are quite well-educated and have a sensitivity that is unexpected in a warrior. We don't.
I've certainly found that with some of my friends.
Right. Yeah. Everybody's not a bar fighting.
Well, some of them are signed to that, right?
Right. Some of it.
I want to point out that some of the materials you use, besides helmets, are described in this pamphlet for your presentation exhibit, Tour of Duty,
right,
which ran at the Cape Ann Historical Museum from June 23 through October 20 in 2001. And it was from this booklet that I read your introduction. Mm-hmm. And I want to mention that because this has many beautiful images of Ken's work, and it uses, in the images, you can see the, boots, and
big deal boots,
dog tags, weapons.
Well, sort of weapons.
Well, that's one of the ironies I think you're talking about.
Right.
You get
right.
Weapons that aren't weapons and weapons that are transformed. Tell me, I don't know how to really ask this. When you were moved to create a sculpture, I'm not a sculptor. I've never tried sculpture.
It's dangerous.
And I don't dare try it because I feel really depressed about it, I think. But so I'm interested about the inspiration one feels for in another art form. How does that, you mentioned Walter Reed.
Right.
Do you go around and see shapes, or you see people in different social conditions or medical conditions? What makes your brain jump?
That's an impossible question to answer because it's so sporadic. Music gets me started. I did a series of welded steel pieces that had to do with the fugue and the form of the fugue, the repetition, the theme, and the repetition of it, trying to make it visual.
That's very interesting to me. One art form, completely different,
Absolutely.
Inspires a second art.
Yeah. So it comes from all over the place. When I was doing the real abstract work that was totally formal, with no hidden meanings, no content other than the form, asymmetry, the volume, texture, all of those formal elements that you try to incorporate just for visual variety, the same way you as a poet bring in words that are multisyllabic, that provide a rhythm in your work. We try to do the same thing visually when we're dealing formally and when we're dealing with content issues. There's a number of elements that are crossovers between all art forms, and I think rhythm is one of them. Asymmetry is one, symmetry and asymmetry. I could go down a long list of formal elements that actually I give my students the list.
Certainly the symmetry and the order in a fugue is very, very, very impressive.
Yeah, and try to do that visually. That's actually one of the assignments I give the class is create a three-dimensional sculpture out of steel that is inspired by the fugal form with the theme and repetition. And so I think they're all somehow in the same language, and it's different languages, but it's the same elements to them. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think maybe the neurons of inspiration or drive might be common to way down at the base, be common to all these different specific expressions of whatever that human need is.
Right. But I can't tell you when I'm going to get fired up about something. Right now I'm in a lull period where I'm moving my studio. I have a studio in Boston I've been in for 26 years, and the area is being gentrified, so the rents are rising outrageously. My rent was going to triple if I tried to get a new lease, and I'm also getting to the point where I'm winding down a little bit. I've got to begin to think in eschatological terms here of how I dispose of all of this work. I've got lots and lots and lots of stuff that predictably didn't sell. So
you're still getting over the fact that you're not gonna be a billionaire on sculpting.
No.
You mentioned you teach. You're still teaching.
I am.
Where do you teach? I know the answer, but and what do you teach, and how do you get your students driven?
That's the hard part. I teach at the museum school, which had been part of the Museum of Fine Arts for 150 some odd years, and but got no support from them financially. It was an independent art school, and it began about 5 years ago to show signs of erosion of the incoming class. We just, because it's an art school, and when you send your kid off to an art school, there's no guarantee of a job, there's no guarantee of anything except personal growth.
So what's that?
What's that worth? So now we're part of Tufts University, and they took us under their wing, and we're part of the College of Arts and Sciences. And I think it's going to be a good mix for everybody. The traditional Medford campus folks have always looked at the museum school over on the Fenway as a sweet place for creativity, not bound too tightly to the Research Institute protocols, and a little more freedom, a little more. We don't give letter grades. We do pass-fail, and so I think it's going to be a good fit.
In a class, how many students would you have, and what is a sculpting class assignment like?
The class size varies. I've had as many as 15 and as few as 5. Depends on the enrollment, depends on where the class is in the progression of the curriculum. And the assignments are, like I just said, to make a welded steel sculpture that emulates the musical fugue. I have an assignment that says I want you to invent a task and then make a machine that does that task. I teach a kinetics class where I give the students that kind of an assignment. And I teach a materials class. I introduce a non-traditional material for them to make sculpture every week. And they have a week to explore the material and come up with the sculpture.
So you have different materials,
yes,
and different aims.
Right.
So, and you have evidently some of these sculptures are mobile, and
some are.
They have arms coming up, and,
right,
and balls running down ramps,
right,
and that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And that's where you try to get the students' imagination to flourish. I take them on field trips. I'm taking them over to Chris Williams' studio tomorrow, actually. And I think it's important for the students to get out of school, to go out and see what's going on in the city and in the county.
I just glanced at the clock, which I should have done a couple of minutes ago. We're about to run out of time, which means I really enjoyed this talk. We are at the end of our half hour, Ken Hruby. I want to thank you very much, sir, for coming down and talking about sculpture. It's a real treat. I shouldn't say this, but it's a real treat to get away from writers once in a while,
right.
And learn something about your accomplishments and your source of inspiration, and also a distinguished military career. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I want to thank you in TV land for being with us too. If you've learned something about Ken Hruby's sculpture and the inspiration of sculpture and how to teach sculpture, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.